Technology is working. So welcome to Politics Aside, this very special edition. Today we're talking about appropriations and the process that goes into the federal process of appropriating projects through U.S. Congress and through the U.S. Senate and then on to the White House. There has been a lot of conversation about appropriations through the years, but I want to start with what it used to be called, and that was earmarking. Now, what is earmarking? And this is where we ought to start, and I'm going to read this so I don't mess it up. The phrase has agricultural origin. Farmers would cut recognizable notches in their livestock's ears to mark the animals as belonging to them. And in most basic sense, to earmark is to flag something that's special. So in practice, it really means funding a project. So it's been called earmarked, the appropriation process. It's been called congressionally directed spending. And today, the common wisdom is it's called community project funding. Now, bless the Congress and as they come up with terminology, but it sounds good, community project funding. Personally, I think earmarks, project funding have gotten a bad rap. There certainly are opportunities within the federal process to fund different projects in communities that the rest of the country may not like. But my perspective is when it comes to funding projects, a member of Congress or the U.S. Senate knows far better where a lot of these monies should go than someone in the administration. So today we're going to talk about the process of appropriating. What does it mean? Cameron Gresh with our team is our senior director at Porter Group. Tell us about it. What does it mean? How does it work?
So really, we're just getting into the very beginning of the appropriations process here in March, which is the typical time that Congress starts soliciting applications for this type of funding. What is going to happen over really the next month is member offices will solicit projects from their constituents, organize them into lists of what they feel is most beneficial to their district or most competitive overall, and then submit those lists to each House and Senate Appropriations Subcommittee. This is usually completed by April to May of any given calendar year. At this point, going from May to about September, both the House and Senate Appropriations Committees separately work on drafting their own, sometimes minibuses, sometimes omnibus appropriations packages that include submissions from each subcommittee. Once each chamber has a bill that they're happy with, they vote it off the House floor, or House or Senate floor, or sometimes a chamber can choose just to, as the Senate did last year, directly start conferencing with the House without passing anything off the floor. After Congress has a bill that it is happy with, which usually occurs sometime in fall of any calendar year, passage of that legislation occurs usually before Christmas, although for FY23, passage did not occur until March. But we're looking at about a 9 to 12 month process from submission to committee passage to enactment into law. Now, that's just the beginning of using congressional project funding. After this, it can be anywhere from 2 to 3 months to even 6 to 9 months to get the guidance from whatever agency owns the account you're pulling your CPF out of about what you need to do in order to receive your money. It usually involves answering the same questions you answered months ago to your member, just to make sure that you didn't miss anything and that everything's on the up and up. So from submission to receipt is anywhere from a 12 to 18 month process.
Thanks, Cameron. We appreciate that. With us also is Stephanie Walker. Some of you may know she's our senior vice president with the Porter Group. Stephanie, so tell us the difference between these different funding processes. What does it mean? And so people can understand that are on the call.
Right. So everyone, we're talking about appropriations, which is the general process that the government has to do to fund all of their programs, right? So you have the budget, that's kind of the overall numbers, and then you have to, that's what they're authorized to spend. And then they want to get into the minutia of that through the appropriations process. What everyone's talking about these days is community project funding, or CPF funding, which is the politically polite term for earmarks. This is what we're all talking about. Earmarks have been back now for the last 2 cycles. So we're, folks are starting to get the hang of them and figure out what's the difference now? Earmarks were very popular and successful throughout the aughts, the 2000s through about 2010, when they were removed at sort of the will of the people, because there was a couple of high profile scandals. It's not to say the entire process was totally corrupted, but there was a couple of issues. Particularly, there's a bridge to nowhere everyone talks about that kind of ended the process with a bang, where a bridge, and I will not name the state, won't call people out. A bridge was earmarked somewhere, and something happened that they couldn't complete it, so it doesn't go anywhere. It's just a bridge sitting in the middle of nowhere, and this kind of was the end of the earmark era. So ultimately, what happened over sort of the next 10 years is that line item spending decisions was relegated to the executive branch. If Congress is not making the project decisions, someone has to make the project decisions. So the executive branch was doing that either through the authority they already have or through a grant process, so people would apply for the money and get it, that kind of thing. So this past few years, Congress has decided they want to take back the spending reins. They want to line item projects. But there's a lot of wariness on making sure that the same corruption didn't happen again. The same issue, I don't want to call it corruption, that's not really fair. The same issues, scandals didn't happen again. So they have a lot of new rules now that are different from the past. It used to kind of be how it evolved was that if there was a project that you thought was important to your district, you kind of said, this is it, this is what the money I want. And there was some, but not many guardrails to that. You could kind of do not whatever you want to be close to. Now the rules are pretty tight. Not only there's a transparency rule across the board, which did not exist before. So every member has to say what they asked for, not just what they got. They have to disclose what they asked for and who asked for it. So that's a big deal because that helps keep people in the light. Also across the board, both the Senate and the House have limited these CPFs to public entities and to nonprofit entities. And some offices have other limitations to protect themselves to make sure that everything's on the up and up. And then finally, and I think most saliently, is now the earmark funds can only come from certain pots. And those, if you're getting an earmark from a pot, you have to meet all of the requirements you would already have to meet to apply for a grant or receive that money without an earmark. So it's basically just circumventing a bureaucratic process, but you can't become eligible when you were not originally eligible. And it's not new money for that project. It's money that already existed that you would have been able to compete for, but your member is saying they don't need to compete because I identify this as a significant project for my constituency. So they should receive this money. They are eligible to receive it. So there's a lot of restrictions on it to make it more transparent and sort of eliminate the risk of scandal.
Because there really was minimal abuse, but anytime you take this large a number of individuals in the process, back through 2001 and 10, were those years, there weren't nearly as many guidelines as you mentioned, Stephanie. So, Mr. Rosenbaum, Bannon's our vice president as well with the Porter Group, and with your experience, Steph's experience, and Cameron's experience, but with yours, what should people be asking for? What's a priority to a member of Congress, and what's a priority to the community?
Yeah, so I mean, to Steph's point, a lot more guardrails now. We kind of have limited, but as she mentioned, we're looking at public entities, so municipalities, counties, public agencies, transportation and infrastructure, those types of things, community development, education. Those are some of the areas that are kind of the big ones. And then nonprofits as well. A lot of folks who sort of operate sort of some of those social services to help with communities in need. That's also a major focus. But, sort of taking a snapshot of the last couple of years, when you look at the types of accounts and where funds have been pulled from, the most requested, highest profile requested areas of focus was on natural resources and the environment. Water is a major issue in all parts of the country. In some places it's too much water, other parts it's too little water. So conservation efforts, flooding, those types of things are things that communities have to deal with. It's not something that is often been able to be accomplished just at the state or local level, but there is a federal aspect to it. And I think that's one of the things that we try and stress with folks who approach us on these issues is that you have to make, what is the federal nexus? Why does the federal government need to be putting resources to support something that this member may want? And so, infrastructure projects, I think, are a really good example of that. It's a way that you can sort of talk about that this is not just helping people get from point A to point B. It helps with commerce. It helps with improving safety in a community. And so you have to kind of build that narrative as to why this project is important and why it deserves taxpayer investments. Just to give folks a little sense as the context of all of this, we're not talking, the federal budget is in the trillions of dollars. The amount of money that is part of congressionally directed spending is less than 1% of the overall federal budget. And that was something that was an agreement between the chairs of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, that they would kind of put an artificial cap on the amount of money that would be set aside for congressionally directed spending, apart from the rest of the budget that funds our military, the State Department, all these different programs that we utilize.
And I'm glad you talked about what does it really mean to the federal budget. Yes, it is a lot of money, but in the scope of things, but it's an easy target, for adversaries or for, certainly someone that's opposed to maybe what a particular senator or congressman is doing. But now again, with the guardrails, it's really far more transparent. I guess on that, you touched upon some public projects, man. Well, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Gresh. One of Cameron's expertise is in the area of communities, municipalities, counties, cities, et cetera. So what does this mean to the public entities, Cameron?
Thank you. Really, I think that the greatest value that any community could pull out of community project funding is, if you look around, there are no shortage of road, wastewater, or clean water infrastructure projects that a city council or county commission might be working on. CPF projects CPF requests, are an excellent way to help get phase 1 or 2 of a project started so that you can carry that momentum forward and finish things out. CPF funding, I think, is really helpful to local governments, particularly in the water and road infrastructure spaces. You're also going to see a lot of utilization out of healthcare and law enforcement related accounts. And I would say together, those are the 4 most common types of CPF requests that you might see out of any given city. But you're going to hear members of our own congressional delegation and others talk about kind of that last mile funding. Community project funding is not designed to completely and totally pay for a brand new highway or road network or sewer substation, but it might pay for the planning and design of that substation that you haven't even begun on yet, and we're looking for ways to fund. Crossing a funding gap or helping you bridge any fiscal gaps in your budget are what CPFs excel at.
And to Cameron's point on this about that it is not all encompassing, it's not a blank check. Many of these accounts, and for folks who've been through the federal grant process, it can be quite complicated. But there's oftentimes regulations already set in law for how those funding streams operate. There's oftentimes a local share requirement, even with the CPFs. So, not unlike a federal grant where there may have to be some local buy-in, there is a requirement on many of these accounts, and they all kind of differ depending on, if it's Department of Education versus the Department of, or the EPA versus the DOT. They all have their own different regulations and requirements that may be required, but there is the need for some kind of local buy-in as well, and not just the dollar amounts, but there's as Congress brought these CPFs back just a couple of years ago, there's a new requirement for a demonstration of community support. So an agency that may be requesting something of a member's office, they and the committee both want to know that this is supported not just by the people who are going to get the money directly, but from the community at large. So oftentimes we'll work with another the county government, if it's for a city, or we'll work with a community partner, a neighborhood association, or some type of nonprofit group that understands why getting that money to fill this project might be beneficial and how it will impact the community. And I think that that's something that really does kind of build these out and to Steph's point, bring them into the light and provide a little bit more transparency when you have to demonstrate community support.
So the four of us have had the honor of serving in some capacity within public service, and we listen to communities, whether it's an airport or a county or a convention authority, you name it, or a school. These entities, as a rule, do have normally support staff that can help, but now there are smaller cities, of course, that don't. But let's say we have a constituent that's in Humboldt, Iowa, or Boulder City, Nevada, that is not on the government city council, but they're a community that a person has an idea. What can they do? What can the average Joe do to be able to see that some projects get funded this way? I throw it out there for the team here.
So I would first say, selfishly, get some help on it. They're a little complicated, as I think Ben and Cameron alluded to. It's programs that already exist, but unless you are someone who is very familiar with the grant space, being able to piece together, hey, am I eligible? What's my match eligibility? Is there an entity that I can use to get a match? Because that's something else. By the way, those exist. So that could match your match, basically. Those are questions that, people like Porter Group, but also other organizations, other entities know how to do, that they can help you do. And I think one of the best, most important pieces of advice for navigating this process I could give is to start early and ask questions early, get into your congressional office or seek representation in January. We're in February now, but get started, because that's how you can get your questions answered.
And to Stephanie's point, I mean, it's that early process, the planning ahead, thinking through some of these projects. In some cases, these have to be kind of pre-vetted, some of these projects. In the transportation space, I'll add, there is a question, it's specific to some of these accounts. Is this part of the state or regional transportation improvement plan? Meaning, has it gone through sort of this budgeting analysis to determine that it is a priority for the region or the state? And that's just a box that the committee asks folks to check so that they have a sense that, oh, it's not just a project someone drew on the back of a napkin, handed over to their friend who's a member of Congress to get funded. It is something that has gone through some kind of public vetting process. And to Steph's point, getting in and having these conversations with the members of Congress, it's one thing to submit a request to a member's office. It's another for it to then become a project that they then submit to the committee. And then it's another thing for the committee to decide it's worthy of being funded, and for it to survive the whole process from it, for that form that you fill out to the member's office, for it to get signed into law by the president, and then to be administered on the back end, to Cameron's point, by that agency who would then be administering the funds. So it is a long and lengthy process. There's a lot of little hurdles along the way, but to make sure that you at least have first done your homework and provided a good project just to the member's office that you're submitting to is step number one.
And if I could include, and you both touched upon it, members of the House of Representatives, the House of the People, and certainly we have the Senate, both sides, but this is what re-elections process is about. It's about serving the community, serving the public. And I have found that most members of Congress, again, I include the Senate in that as well, will help you. So let's say that you're not, the city of 1 million people, and you have a community idea, and you want to share this with your member of Congress. Don't hesitate, because the staffing is there in these offices to help you. And again, some have paid professional people helping within their entities. But let's say you don't hesitate to ask a member. The staff will help. You have to do the groundwork, but don't worry about asking the question, because and you can always go back and ask again. But on that, let's talk about the politics. So We have the left, the right, the middle, whatever, progressives, conservatives. This is 2023. What is the appetite now from the political perspective of community directed funding?
So I worked for a Republican when in Congress back when I worked on the Hill. So I'll kind of take the Republican side. There's been a lot on the Republican side. It was actually Republicans in 2011 who got rid of earmarks. Paul Ryan, this question came up for him in, I want to say 2017, and he declined to reinstate them when he was Speaker of the House. So Republicans have sort of repeatedly said that they don't like earmarks. They think they lead to corruption. They want to lower spending. They're not for them. This is not me trying to call anyone out. Republicans asked for much more in earmarks than Democrats in the last cycle. They asked, this is not what they were awarded, it's what they asked for. They asked for $20 million more, which is a lot because of the percentages, than Democrats in the last earmark cycle. This is according to the Brookings Institute. So the reality is that even if you oppose earmarks as a theoretical idea, you don't want to leave money on the table. A lot of, and I can tell you, I know this from inside the conference, most Republican members are in favor of earmarks when it comes to the vote, because it was overwhelming. Their caucus votes are not recorded, their voice vote, internal door, it's overwhelmingly supportive. It's not my way of calling people out. I just think that there is a difference between, there's a perception that an earmark is some sort of swampy backroom deal scenario, but what it really is Congress having the power of the purse and doing line item spending, which is their constitutional authority. So Republicans, no matter if they say they don't want them or do want them, or if they really don't or do, what you don't want is for there to be funds available for your constituents, your local governments, to fix their roads, whatever they want to do. And you say, I'm going to leave it on the table and I'm going to let the guy from the state next to me get those funds. So it's one of those things where, despite there being some bad politics on the right, it doesn't really make sense not to participate, which kind of keeps the program healthy.
On that subject, I think an underserved community and another area where we spend, a lot of our emphasis on individuals with disabilities in employment. We represent cities, counties, airports, defense contractors, chambers. We have quite a diverse group of clients that we work with, but we're also very selective. But one area that we really focus on is individuals with disabilities. And I guess, Steph, while you still have the floor, what are your thoughts for some folks in that community that really need help the most?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of nonprofits out there who do great work for individuals with disabilities. And nonprofits are one of the entities that are naturally eligible for quite a few federal funding pools, and therefore for the CPF process. There's also been new money recently that's going into this area because there's been a big push toward sort of modernizing programs for people with disabilities. So there's a lot of opportunity to take advantage of these programs and to uplift the disabled community, whether that is tools for employment, whether that is transportation, whether that is healthcare. So there's quite a bit of opportunity, I would say, and I think right now it's being a bit underutilized. So hopefully it's something that picks up.
Well, thank you, Steph, and Ben. Sorry, I was picking on Steph since she had her mic was turned on. But we were talking about politics and what does it mean. And thank you for your thoughts, Stephanie. Ben, what's your perspective on the politics of all this?
Yeah, well, it's no secret. I can say this from the left. I worked for a Democratic member of Congress, couple of them, on the Hill for 15 years nearly. And Democrats like to spend money, but they like to spend money on things that they think make a difference. And that could be debated. But when it was Democrats who brought back earmarks a couple of years back, and some will make the argument that they don't want unelected bureaucrats in the agencies to decide where the dollars are going. But for many, it's because this is a way to target those dollars to communities that may not be able to navigate the process. To the point I think we've discussed about not everybody's got paid staff who are experts bipartisan grants and what have you. But there was some analysis just looking at last year's requests, and more than 1 out of every 10 projects that were submitted from a Democratic office was focused on the working poor. About 13% of the projects targeted either programs or things dealing with poor or working class Americans. And I think that that's an indication, compare that to around 3% for Republican requests, that was a way that Democrats were able to target some of these dollars into underserved or underrepresented communities. Also, you saw large percentage of projects, nearly 8%, that may have focused on racial or minority groups. Nearly 8% of projects for the Democrat requests were focused on young people and education. So you can see, as they kind of do a breakdown between Republicans and Democratic requests, where some of the emphasis is. There was a higher request, maybe not surprisingly, from Republicans for rural America and for farming communities. They may represent more rural communities. So you start to see, that they're trying to direct dollars towards projects or programs that may not otherwise see federal investment.
Yeah, and Republicans, to Ben's point, requested large dollar projects like infrastructure projects at a much higher rate than Democrats. So Democrats were asking for sort of smaller programs that are kind of community based, whereas Republicans are focused on things like roads or sewers or that kind of larger scale project. Kind of shows the difference in thinking on community impact.
Technology issue, sorry about that. What's going to happen beyond tomorrow? Tomorrow, of course, could be next year, but what do you see happening? What's the future of earmarks as we see it?
Yeah, well, as Cameron pointed out, we're kind of in the midst of the beginning of this season. We are expecting to see guidance as soon as maybe this week or next week from House Appropriations Committee. We'll come see what types of changes with the new Republican majority that they want to make and how they want to earmark this process, I guess. And then that'll kind of kick off the process. We've got the president's budget that's due out in less than a month. That will help to dictate kind of where the broader Appropriations Committee's efforts will go. The Senate will also be engaging in this process. We could be getting guidance from them soon. Members are going to start sending out their forms, and we're going to start filling things out and getting those requests in and engaging with the offices to make sure they're fully briefed on what these projects are. But then it's the big question mark is, but with a divided government, with a House that's a Republican majority that has a lot of thoughts about the way the administration and Democrats had operated the Congress the last few years, with a slight Democratic majority, but a Democratic majority all the same in the Senate. Will they be able to reach an agreement on an appropriations bill by the end of this fiscal year, the end of September? And Cameron mentioned the timeline. We typically are passing these bills in an omnibus fashion or a minibus fashion at the end of the calendar year, but Congress is supposed to be done with this work by the end of September. If not, we face a government shutdown. We've seen this happen in the past. Now, it's not always these community funding projects that are the focus of those fights between Democrats and Republicans. That wasn't the case last year as well. There were fights over a lot of other issues, but with a debt ceiling issue hanging over, a cloud hanging over Washington, and a determination by congressional Republicans to limit spending. You saw a lot of folks who were added to the Appropriations Committee from the Republican side. Many of them were people who did not support the speaker, and maybe there was some trading going along there, but they are determined to see reductions in domestic spending. So there's going to be a lot of debate between now and September on how to reach an agreement to keep the government operating, even apart from this entire community funding project side.
So we have the immediate opportunities open literally today as we speak, and more info to follow literally tomorrow. There's a clock that's ticking for the year. We talked a little bit about the appropriation process. I mean, you could have a member of Congress support your project. You could have them submit your project, and it may not be accepted by the committee. Or you may be able to, via a member of Congress, have a project that is accepted by the committee. Then it has to be voted on by both houses. Then actually the formula, but there is no guarantee then even until the end of the year, right? whether or not it will actually end up in a final bill or whether it will pass and go to the White House, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I mean, it was the end of almost right before Christmas when they finally reached an agreement and pulled the bills together, gave us the final text, which included the fiscal year 22 community funding projects. So, yeah.
And I know we need to wrap up, but I was asked today by a community, well, if a city, if we're not able to get it finished in the next 3 weeks, our request, because it takes some homework on what it is and what you need it for. Well, can we just do it next year? And I guess I want to leave everyone with that we don't know what's going to happen next year. We do know this year that the foundation is laid for an opportunity for many of you on this call to request community directed funding. Don't hesitate, don't be bashful, ask your member of Congress and meet with their staff and find out. And I don't care how big, how small, if you don't ask, you're never going to know. And I guess my last question, how much was allocated and funded in this process last year into the country?
Yeah, so just shy of 5,000 projects were funded overall. And the total number was around $9 billion for community directed spending, or community project funding, congressionally directed spending. Yeah, so just shy of 5,000 projects in all 50 states and the territories, and just shy of $9 billion, which again, a little under, less than 1% of the overall federal budget.
But do not be bashful, and please ask your member of Congress or someone our team is there to help, but there is a lot of great firms here that do this, as a specialty. So I want to take this moment and say thank you, Stephanie and Ben and Cameron, as part of our team at the Porter Group. As you know, Politics Aside is something that we started earlier in the year, and that is to have an opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions or even follow up later. But my goal with Politics Aside really is to provide an opportunity for all of you to meet some of individuals such as the team here today that are really making a difference in the world. I'm proud of this team. I'm proud of what we do, and I'm proud of all of you for being a part of the community. So with that, just remember, all we ask is that you have enjoyed the program and that you're able to sit back and put politics aside just for a few moments. So thank you all. All the best from Washington, D.C.